What is up, everybody? It is another week here on the Factory Tour. I'm your host, Paul Patterson. I'm here today with another returning guest coming in clutch, filling in this week. He wasn't even supposed to be here this week, but here he is. He's ready to talk about the tight end position. He's ready to talk about a fun little format you should try called Dynasty Best Ball. His name is Chris Miles, also known as the Draft Director on Twitter. You know who he is. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Paul. I'm glad I got to play sixth man and fill in for the podcast this week.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you jumping in here. We're going to go right into just the little news section that we do. First piece of news is really the only interesting thing to happen in the NFL landscape that isn't like a coach narrative in the past couple of weeks, and that is DeAndre Hopkins being released by the Arizona Cardinals. So let's talk a little bit about the fantasy fallout of this, starting with the Hopkins side of the equation. Obviously, the Cardinals weren't really projected to be a really strong offense this year, so Hopkins gets the chance to spread his wings and fly away to a better team. What do you think about Hopkins? Were you buying into him before this? Have you changed your stance on him now that he's a free agent?
I thought he was actually a pretty good price if you were a contender before. You could get him for about 2 seconds, and that's, for a guy that could be the top 6 or 8 wide receiver this year, that's, a perfectly palatable price. But obviously, in most cases, the situation is going to get better because he's not going to have a rookie quarterback potentially for first half of the season. And if he gets to the nuts like the Chiefs or the Bills or something like that, I mean, he's going to definitely go up in value and be a high coveted asset for contenders.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what he's going for in trades right now. I have a feeling that some people are going to be overreacting, maybe spending a little bit too highly on him, just hoping that he lands on the Chiefs or the Bills. I think for one thing, if he lands on the Chiefs, there's no guarantee that he's going to be like a top 5 or top 8 wide receiver just based on how they seem to utilize wide receivers in that offense. Not that I think it would be a bad spot, but I'm worried people would overcorrect his price. So I'm glad that I already had some shares. I'm probably going to wait for things to just settle down before I pick up any more because he could land also, in some crowded wide receiver rooms. We don't really know where he's going to go. The Chiefs and the Bills have questionable cap situations. There's usually ways around doing that, but we don't know for sure where he's going to land. We heard rumors about the Browns. We've heard rumors that he wants to go to the Texans. Where do you think would be a good spot for him outside of those main 2 that people want?
Outside of those 2, a good spot.
Just thought I'd put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
With a question that wasn't on the show sheet.
I mean, if he went to the Packers and Jordan Love wasn't absolutely terrible, it's a pretty wide open depth chart. I mean, he could definitely step in as the wide receiver 1 right over Watson and, probably get close to a 28% target share, maybe 30%. Watson's not a high percent target earner, even though he's very efficient on his targets. So, yeah, I think Green Bay could be a good spot.
Yeah, definitely an open target distribution there. I mean, I believe in Watson, and I think you see a snaps increase. He's going to see a higher target share this year, but absolutely room for Hopkins to step in and be the wide receiver 1 there. I think for me, it would be the Jets. I think, after Garrett Wilson, it's really just Alan Lazard and I don't even know, Corey Davis, I guess, are the other wide receivers there. So pairing him with Aaron Rodgers would be pretty exciting. And I think him and Wilson could really consolidate that target share and both of them could thrive. I don't really want to see him go to the Texans again, like with a rookie quarterback, even though that's a wide open depth chart. You don't really want to see him with a rookie quarterback because we know that impacts fantasy production. It's still not going to be a great offense. So that would be kind of one of your worst options, I think. The Browns would be interesting. Obviously, crowded wide receiver room there with Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, David Njoku, but he could assert his dominance and still lead that team in targets and obviously have a good quarterback that he's familiar with there. So it'll be an interesting one to monitor. How about in Arizona? Does this change your outlook on some guys there, namely Hollywood Brown?
Yeah, I think Hollywood Brown should actually stay about the same as he was. He was, looking at about a 22%, 24% target share already without Hopkins. I don't see him being like over 26% share target earner. I think it probably helps the ancillary targets a little more, like Dortch and Rondale Moore and Michael Wilson, if you like those guys. Mm-hmm. But I think that the overall offense is definitely going to suffer a lot from this. There's not going to be many touchdowns scored. There's going to be a lot of stalled drives. I'm probably not looking to really add anybody to my team unless it's Hollywood Brown.
Yeah, I think what you said about his usage is correct, but looking at his ADP at the 712 as the wide receiver 34, I feel like there was definitely some DeAndre Hopkins discount built into that price, and we could definitely see him rise. I think that's a good value for him if you had grabbed him there in startups earlier this offseason. I definitely think he deserves to be, you know, in the same, at least in the same conversation as guys like Terry McLaurin and Chris Godwin, not going almost a full round after them. So guy you could probably get at a discount, and another guy that's probably going to overcorrect in price because ultimately this isn't going to be a good offense, and he could be catching passes from Colt McCoy for quite a while. So we don't want to get out of our skis with the projections, but he is a good player. He's always been a good target earner. Um, let's talk about one other thing that's not really news, but it has been making the rounds on Twitter pretty heavily these past couple of weeks, and that's this Travis Etienne Tank Bigsby conversation. There was really one tweet that kind of sparked the whole thing, but now there's this discussion of, is Travis Etienne going to be limited by the addition of Tank Bigsby, and is his upside capped, and is Tank Bigsby going to have a bigger role than we think? So I guess, what are your overall thoughts about this backfield? These two guys, do you like both of them? Are you worried about Etienne? How do you see this thing shaking out?
Well, before it happened, I pretty confidently say that ETN had top five RB upside probably for the season. But the issue is that they added Tank Bigsby, who's an elite reception share earner in college. So if their plan is to use him a lot for receiving, which we saw them not really use Travis Etienne much for receiving last year, so they clearly don't think he's good at it, don't want to use him in that way. So if they're adding Tank Bigsby to get the receptions, that definitely hurts ETN's upside, and I'm worried about his value as Dynasty RB8 or whatever he is right now.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I agree with what you're saying. It's interesting for me because I don't actually think that Tank Bigsby changes much of how I felt about Travis Etienne. I guess I just already thought he was overvalued. Like, I guess I don't see it as like Etienne had all of this work that was going to be his, and then Tank Bigsby showed up and got it. It's more like there was all of this work that Etienne wasn't going to get regardless, and Tank Bigsby is now the guy that's going to get it. But based on how we saw him use last year, they wanted to use JaMychal Hasty on passing downs more so than Etienne. He didn't get that high target share that we were expecting. He wasn't particularly impressive on the receptions that he did have. So I guess I just wasn't really expecting him to ever turn into that high volume target earner. And so for me, it's not that Bigsby is stealing any work. It's just that he's filling a role that already existed in the backfield. So I think it's kind of a silly conversation overall. I like both guys, but I think ETN and Dynasty is still a little bit overpriced, where I'd rather pay down for like a Josh Jacobs or a Ramondre Stevenson. We talked about this last week with Billy. But I've been soaking up Tank Bigsby in the late second because I do think he's going to have a lot of contingent upside at the very least. I don't know about standalone value, but if ETN were to go down, like you said, he has that requisite pass catching skill set and he's a capable rusher. He was super productive in college. So I think both of these guys can be, you don't have to pick a side. Like, you can like both guys and just understand what they are. But we can both agree Tank Bigsby's not going to steal his job.
Yeah, no, I mean, Travis Etienne is going to get the larger share of the workload overall. He's probably going to double him in carries. And he'll probably be around, they'll probably tie in targets. Maybe Tank Bigsby leads a little bit. But yeah, it just sucks that we saw Etienne come in with this great receiving profile and it's just never been realized in the NFL. And now they draft another running back on day 2 with a great receiving profile. So it just really sucks for Etienne's upside.
Yeah, it was a good bet to make. It just doesn't always pan out that way. Sometimes coaches have different ideas of how they want to use players. And so Travis Etienne's a really good rusher, but it doesn't look like he's going to get that, Christian McCaffrey type upside as a receiver. So whatever, we can live with it. He's still a good player. He's still going to be valuable in Dynasty. It's just we don't want to get too aggressive with our projections. He might not have the same kind of ceiling as some guys going ahead of him. All right, we're going to move on to one of the main segments of the show here. We're going to talk pretty comprehensively about the tight end position. It's one of the more interesting. I think it's probably the most interesting position to talk about in Dynasty because there's just no one way that people approach it. And there's just so much to be discussed about positional scarcity and positional advantage. It's a very complicated position to work through, whereas other positions are more about, just building out projections and market shares. But there's a lot more like philosophy involved, I guess, in the tight end position. So I think it's interesting. And I wanted to talk specifically about elite tight ends and why I think that elite tight ends are very valuable, that I think you should be targeting them aggressively. And then from there, we can kind of move into the rest of the tight end landscape. We're going to talk about two specific elite tight ends that are Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts. Chris, do you have a preference between these two players in Dynasty, and why?
So this is really tough for me. I've had Kyle Pitts as my tight end one for a while, but I think I'm going to move Mark Andrews in my one spot just because of the record of production that he has, and there's no way that I'm really seeing that drop off in the future, where we're still waiting for Kyle Pitts to have that elite season, and we've seen Mark Andrews, who is still a relatively young tight end, outproduce Travis Kelce and be the tight end one in a season. So I think for right now, I'm taking Mark Andrews just for the assuredness and also the guaranteed ceiling.
Okay, fair enough. Love it. Let me circle back for a second here. I did a bad job of introducing things. To be clear, I have Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts as my top two Dynasty tight ends. Do you have them ranked that way as well?
Yes, I do. They're my top two tight ends.
Okay, because per ADP from Bulletproof Fantasy, Travis Kelce is still the first tight end drafted in Dynasty startups. He goes at the 302, followed by Pitts at the 307, then Mark Andrews at 312. So just right off the bat, we're both off of the general consensus, not by a lot, but by a little, having Travis Kelce ranked third out of those three. So why is it that you're willing to take those two guys ahead of Travis Kelce, who has been the tight end one basically every year for the past 6 seasons?
All right. Well, it's mainly age at this point. I mean, Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews are producing similar numbers, and Mark Andrews is 26 and Travis Kelce is 33. And then Pitts is 23 years old. I mean, he's 10 years younger than Kelce, and he has the upside to be, a perennial tight end one, tight end two person, just like Kelce has been. So, yeah, especially if I can get these cheaper in Dynasty, similar production upside, and save a decade of time, I'm going to do that every single time.
Yeah. Just to fact check you real quick. Mark Andrews is actually 28 years old, and he will be 29 this coming season.
Then Bulletproof ADP is lying to me because they said
Kyle Pitts is 22.6 years old. So just to be precise. But yes, Travis Kelce is 33, and it's age. I mean, he cannot continue doing what he's doing forever. I will not be surprised if he's the tight end one this season. I will be mildly surprised, but not devastatingly shocked if he's the tight end one the following season. After that, I'm going to be really surprised if he could keep up what he's doing. And if he is the tight end one the next 2 years, there's a very strong case to take him first out of these three. But that isn't a guarantee. And what we do know is that these other two guys are capable of producing the same type of numbers. We have not seen it yet from Kyle Pitts. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on him in a little bit to explain why I believe he's capable of that. But with Mark Andrews, we have seen it. He did it a couple of seasons ago when the Ravens offense was much stronger. And at age 28, there's no reason to think that he's lost that ability. What happened is that the Ravens offense took a step back. Lamar dealt with injuries, and the team realized they needed to go a different direction with the offense. They removed Greg Roman from the equation. They've brought in Todd Monken. The pass rate is probably going to go up. That's only going to be good for Mark Andrews. Lamar Jackson is back on an extension. This offense could legitimately be one of the best in the league. If you just look at all their skill position players, you look at Lamar, if they can unleash him in a little bit more modern pass heavy offense, we could absolutely see Andrews repeat what he did. Now, I have Pitts ranked first of these three simply because of the age, because I have no doubts about his ability that he can do exactly what these other two guys are doing. And I'm just going to, even if it doesn't happen for him this season in this version of the Atlanta offense, I'm just going to take the chance on that because of the youth and the longevity, where I don't think Andrews is necessarily going to be in the twilight of his career anytime soon, but he is getting up to an age at least where he's going to have to maintain this tight end one season after season in order to stay where he is, in order to do what Travis Kelce has been doing. So in a way, I feel like Kyle Pitts is a little bit of a safer investment at this point, which seems backwards, I guess, because of his lack of actual fantasy production. But anyway, does that line of thinking make sense? Am I totally off base here?
No, yeah, I agree. I think that was a good way to put it. He's a safer investment because of the age and because we know he has that elite upside. I mean, he had 1,000 yards as a rookie. That's a top 5 tight end season ever. He just hasn't been there with the touchdowns, and obviously the Atlanta offense has been pretty run heavy. But I mean, yeah, Kyle Pitts has the prospect profile, the athleticism, the production, everything you want to see in a tight end, and he's not even 23, as you said. So yeah, I mean, having him as your tight end 1 in Dynasty, a guy that's going to be in the conversation of top 3 tight end every year for the next decade, that's perfectly worth having as your number 1 guy.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad that we see some common ground there. I don't have a big gap between the two, and I have no issue with anybody taking Andrews over Pitts or Pitts over Andrews. I do feel pretty strongly that those two guys need to be the top 2. And I also feel strongly that they need to be valued even more so than they currently are. I think that both of these guys warrant round 2 startup consideration, at least in tight end premium leagues, because they offer a huge positional advantage. So what I mean by that is when you look at the tight end 1 last year, Travis Kelce, the gap between him and the tight end 12, and this is in points per game, which was Darren Waller at 9.4. That's the same as the gap from Cooper Kupp, the wide receiver 1 last year, to the wide receiver 27, which was Chris Olave. It was a 9.2 points per game gap between those positions. And we see similar numbers each and every season from these top end producers to the back end. Like tight end 12, that's a tight end 1. Like there are 12 tight ends being started in your league every week. So in other words, in any given week, somebody is starting a tight end that's going to score half as many points as as the tight end 1 is going to score. So this is a huge gap. And at wide receiver, it's just much flatter. And so while those top end guys are super valuable, it's just a lot easier to get comparable production, or at least 85%, 90% of that production. Whereas with the elite tight ends, you either have them or you don't. There's no half measures that you can make. And so we know Kelsey's that guy. We know Andrews has been that guy. We believe Pitts can be that guy. Are there other players in the league that are capable of that type of a positional advantage in your mind?
I guess if we're saying if they have the potential, yeah, I think so. I mean, Dalton Kincaid, that's a guy that has the potential. Obviously, we have no record of seeing as he hasn't played in the NFL yet, but I mean, we have no idea with these rookies. We think he's good, a good prospect. He went to a good landing spot. He got good draft capital. I mean, he could absolutely be a guy that ends up being a perennial top 3 tight end.
Right. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know for sure if he gets that heavy slot usage. It's possible he soaks up a lot of targets. What about some established players, like guys that we know have been in the league for maybe 2+ seasons? Are there any guys in that range? Well, let's talk about one who is the tight end 4 in ADP. Let's start there. TJ Hawkinson is a guy that people seem to think, at least the consensus seems to think, has that same type of a ceiling. He's going at the 409. That's only 9 slots after Mark Andrews. Do you think TJ Hawkinson belongs in that conversation? Can he do the same thing that these guys can do, where they can give you that massive advantage over the field?
Yeah, I don't really think so. I mean, he could, run hot with touchdowns and, have a 15 touchdown season or something like that. But he's just not going to be like a 28% target share earner like some of these guys are. Doesn't really have the athleticism these guys have to make those like yards after the catch plays. He's purely a volume guy, and he's very dependent on his situation. I think he got boosted a lot when he went to the Vikings because, the Vikings have bad defense and they love to pass the ball. And they had Justin Jefferson and really no one else. So TJ Hawkinson was just soaking up so many targets. I don't think you can consistently rely on him to be like, my tight end is guaranteed to score 10 or more points than your tight end when you have TJ Hawkinson. I don't think he's that kind of guy.
I totally agree with you there. I was hoping that you would go that route because I really, really want to dunk on TJ Hawkinson. And not that he's a bad player. He's a good player. It's just people think that he unlocked some new level of potential last season in Minnesota, when in reality, this was simply a change of scenery. This was a change of offensive context. He had a 20.5% target share last season. He had a 21% target share the year before. He did not become a better target earner. He wasn't really more efficient on his targets. In fact, I believe his yards per route run actually decreased once he reached Minnesota. And that's because he was running all of the routes. He was on the field all the time. It was Justin Jefferson and the ghost of Adam Thielen and then TJ Hawkinson. And they averaged over 40 pass attempts per game while he was in Minnesota, which was like tops in the NFL. So there were all of these factors working together to make him into this PPR monster. And even at that point, he still wasn't offering you like what Kelsey was doing every week. But that was like the absolute perfect situation. Now we have Addison brought in the first round. He's obviously going to be a much bigger threat to the target share than Adam Thielen was last season. And we have just natural regression coming in terms of the pass attempts. Like they're not going to average 41, 42 attempts per game. There's maybe one, two teams this season that does that, usually none. So we have to expect that Hawkinson's production is naturally going to come down, and going into the 5th season of his career, he's probably not going to really develop any further. So expecting what we got last season is, I think, a little bit overly optimistic. And I apologize if you heard me give most of this rant last week. I just think it really needs to be said that Hawkinson is a guy who is overvalued. There is no reason to be paying up for him 2 full rounds ahead of Dallas Goedert, a round and a half ahead of George Kittle. He should be projected right in line with those guys. There's no reason why those guys can't just outscore him this season or score similarly to him. He is not in this conversation in terms of positional advantage because he doesn't have the same types of per route numbers. That's the thing that Kelsey, Andrews, Pitts, their targets per route run, their yards per route run are incredibly high. And so they're able to make a much bigger impact. That's why they can get 1,000 yards in the season. Hawkins has never had 1,000 yards in the season. Even last year, he fell short because he's not getting enough yards on each play. He's not making these explosive plays. He's just sort of catching, falling down. We saw it from Zach Ertz, and it worked for a few years when he was getting massive amounts of targets. But even he had a much higher target shares throughout his career than we've seen from Hawkinson. So there just isn't any meat left on the bone for him to improve. And he already, at this point, hasn't been that difference-making guy. We can say, yeah, tight end 5, tight end 6. That's not really what we're talking about. That's a consistent player. That's not a bad player to have on your team, but it's also not the kind of player you want to spend a 4th-round startup pick on because he's not giving you an advantage.
Right, and I love what you said, too. I really think, like, Dallas Goedert is a great pivot from TJ Hawkinson. He's in a great offensive situation, and he's just a guy that's has high touch on upside and is going to get targets. Another guy I like to pivot off of, too, is, like, Darren Waller with the depleted Giants wide receiver room. We've seen Darren Waller be this guy, this number 1, number 2, number 3 tight end, and now he's at a place where he might get absolutely funneled targets. So with Darren Waller going 5 rounds later, I would definitely be getting rid of my TJ Hawkinson and picking up Darren Waller.
Yeah, I think Waller's really that last guy for contenders to target where he's going so late because of some injuries he's had recently. He's 30 years old, but he could absolutely bounce back and have a couple great seasons here. And he can give you maybe not what Kelsey and Andrews can give you, but he can give you
he can give you similar to TJ Hawkinson production.
Exactly. Hawkinson, Goddard, Kittle for half the price. He's that great discount. He's kind of like the Tyler Lockett of tight ends now at this point. And I think that he still has that ability, maybe not quite at his peak, but on this team competing with Isaiah Hodgins and Paris Campbell, yeah, I think he can have a pretty high target share. And he works in an area of the field that Daniel Jones has liked to target recently. So I love picking up Waller. Let's stay on the elite tight ends for a second. I want to talk about another reason why these guys should be valued so highly, and that's because of predictability. At wide receiver, at running back, there are players offering difference-making seasons that give you an advantage, but it's not the same players every year. There's a lot of turnover at the position. There's a lot of changes happening. It's very impacted by situation. Whereas at tight end, I just went back through the top positional rankings. Just go on Fantasy Pros, go on the average points per game. It's the same guys every single season. Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, Waller, Gronkowski, Ertz. These guys were top 3 tight ends for like multiple years in a row, 4 or 5 years in a row, because the position is so thin. There are so few guys that are getting the type of utilization that these players are getting, that have the combination of athleticism, that have the route participation, that have the coaches behind them want to use them this way. And so that's probably why you see people so aggressively going after Dalton Kincaid, where his ADP is being inflated and people are talking about him as a top 10 tight end even this season. It's because there are so few guys that we can point to and say, like, this guy's a full-time receiving weapon, getting a high target share. Like, those guys don't exist, you know? So when you're choosing, at least the mystery box has that potential. And so that's why he's already the tight end 7 in ADP, because everybody's like, well, we know these other tight ends aren't it. Maybe Kincaid's it. They're all chasing the next guy. And so I say, hey, how about instead of rolling the dice every season, just go get the guy? Like, go draft Kyle Pitts, draft Mark Andrews, or trade for those players, because you already know what they are. And ultimately, there's so few of them that if you're making the bet on the next one, it's probably not going to happen, because it happens so infrequently that another one of these players comes out of the woodwork. And when they do, it's rarely even the ones that we expect, right? George Kittle, 5th round pick, Darren Waller, converted wide receiver, even Travis Kelce, you know, he was a 3rd round pick. He had character concerns. So it's hard to predict. It's funny. It's hard to predict the ones that will become elite. And then once they're elite, it's super easy to predict them to stay that way. Whereas at other positions, it's easier to predict the players coming in to become elite. Like Jamar Chase, everybody saw that coming. And then once they get there, there's a lot of, like, you know, variation year to year. Whereas some guys are going to be at the top, Jefferson, Chase, whatever. But otherwise, it's going to keep churning through and you're going to see new names. So that's why I think it's worth spending up on one of these tight ends. And that brings me to my next question, Chris, which is, how do we get these guys on our teams? Okay, let's start in a startup. How highly, I'm sorry, lost my train of thought. How highly would you be willing to take a Kyle Pitts or a Mark Andrews in a startup? First, in the context of like regular league, tight end premium, 12-team super flex, where are you looking for these types of guys?
Yeah, I think in the mid-second is where I'd start being pretty happy with them. After the first maybe 10 quarterbacks, after you get like Jefferson, Chase, Lamb, Brown, Wilson, after those wide receivers, I'm ready to start, getting my tight ends ready. I mean, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts. Another reason why I think it's really important to value these guys is they're almost like the quarterback position when trading for them, where you're not going to get an elite tight end unless you're giving up a at least average tight end. No one's trading away their Kelce, Pitts, or Andrews without getting back like a Goddard or a Freiermuth or Hawkinson, or you need to give something in return. So if you just say, "Oh, I'm just going to pass on the tight ends, I'll buy one later," it doesn't really work that way. You need to at least get one of those top 6 guys to even have a bartering chip to buy into that elite tier. So if I can not even have to spend the extra lower capital and just buy the elite guy right away in the startup, I'm just going to target him right there.
That is absolutely true. That's so true. I had this exact situation happen where I had a really good team, minus the tight end last year. I literally, Tyler Conklin was my best tight end. I don't know how that happened, but it just happened. And so I was trying like crazy to try to buy a Mark Andrews or Kyle Pitts. And I would send the biggest offers, huge offers, but the guy would like the same people. Obviously it's just 2 owners, because that's the only 2 players I was trying to trade for. They kept, no matter what I offered them, they kept writing me back like, yeah, I mean, that's a really strong offer, but like, I need a tight end. That's a really good offer, but I need someone I can play. I don't want to start Tyler Conklin. And I'm like, that's fair. But there's nothing you could do. Like I had to go and try to get another tight end so I could do exactly what you just said. And that's why I've been so happy to grab not only Dalton Kincaid in rookie drafts, but also Sam Laporta and Michael Mayer, because I think that whether or not those guys do pan out, they're going to become at least bargaining chips to get my foot in the door in trades so that I can flip them. I think they are good, but at least I can, if I want to, I can try to flip them to get into a Pitts or Andrews, or at least into like a Kittle or a Goddard or something without giving up the world, because otherwise you have to really overpay to grab one of these tight ends. People don't want to look at their tight end position and see something really gross. They don't want to have to start Mike Gesicki. They don't want to have to start Trey McBride right now. So that's a really strong point. Now, what I'll say on the startup discussion is that I care about ADP. I like to try to draft on ADP. So I've drafted Kyle Pitts in a couple startups this year. I've drafted Mark Andrews in one, and I've done it in the early 3rd every time, because that's where they go. But if this was like in a vacuum and I was never allowed to make a trade, there was no market considerations, I would be taking them in the early 2nd. I would take them. I believe I would take them over any wide receiver other than Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. And the reason for that is, like I just said, it's so hard to find these types of players. Like a CeeDee Lamb is great, but Garrett Wilson just came out last year and he's already right there, like ranked next to CeeDee Lamb, right?
Yep.
And there's guys like that every season that come in. We don't see that at tight end. Like Brock Bowers might be that guy next year, but otherwise, we don't really see these tight ends come in and just immediately ascend. Like they're the second coming, you know? Whereas a wide receiver, every year we see new guys move into that second, third round of startups. It just keeps churning through. A couple years ago, it was Chris Godwin, it was DJ Moore, it was Juju Smith-Schuster. It didn't really work out for those guys. You know, whereas a tight end, it's just we have a lot more confidence in how they're going to be. So in a vacuum, I'd be taking these guys much, much higher. And so I guess what I'm saying is don't be afraid to make an aggressive offer in your league for one of these tight ends. Don't think about it just in terms of their ADP or what their market value is. Think about it in terms of what they can offer your team. And what I would say is if you're going to make that kind of a trade, think about what you can offer, right? And so that's going to bring me to my next point. Let's say we're not in a startup. Let's say we're in an established dynasty league, you know, 1, 2, 3 years in, and now you want to upgrade your tight end position. Like Chris said, you're probably going to need to offer at least a legitimate tight end in return. But Chris, are there any types of players you'd be looking to trade, any kinds of trade packages you want to put together to acquire an Andrews or Pitts?
Some guys I'm actually trying to sell right now would be like, I mean, we already talked about TJ Hawkinson. I'm trying to get out of the TJ Hawkinson, George Kittle, Dallas Goedert tier and move them up into whatever I can out of the elite three.
Mm-hmm.
Another guy I'm trying to sell is like, I'm trying to sell those wide receivers that haven't really produced yet, but are still highly valued or at least carry some value, like Jameson Williams or Elijah Moore. Those are two guys I've been trying to sell a lot lately. Basically just trying to package a tight end, look at your trade partner's team and figure out what they need. People tend to just, oh, I want this player. They go to the proposed trade and they pick the players off their team they don't want, they send them. You got to at least look at the guy's team. If he's short on running backs, add a running back you don't need. If he's short on wide receivers, add a wide receiver you don't need. You know, whatever you can do where you're still winning the trade, but you can make that guy feel better about accepting it.
Yeah, I think those are all ways to get it done. Obviously, someone like an Elijah Moore, Jameson Williams, you're still going to need to add more on top of that, you know, more draft picks or package of players. Let me go ahead and list off some more high profile names too that I'd be very happy to put in a package to get one of these tight ends. These are guys like Travis Etienne, who we just talked about, or Kenneth Walker, running backs that still have a lot of market value that I don't see offering a lot of value above replacement. Same thing at wide receiver. Jalen Waddle goes ahead of both of these tight ends. So I already went off on him last week. I'm not going to go on the whole Jalen Waddle rant again. He's overvalued. If you could trade down from Waddle and pick up one of these tight ends and something else, like maybe you trade Waddle and David Njoku and you get Kyle Pitts and some lower tier wide receiver, even like a Marvin Mims or a Mike Williams or something. That's a huge win in my book. I'd rather have these tight ends straight up over Jalen Waddle because of the value over replacement that they can provide. Same goes for T. Higgins, Devonta Smith. I'm happy to pivot down from like an AJ Brown into one of these tight ends and get a little bit on top. JSN, I would trade straight up if you have a rookie, somebody caught up in the rookie fever. Those are some guys that I think you can really make a realistic trade with somebody because those are some really high profile names, players that people want, players that they're excited about. So if you can dangle one of those guys with a lower tier tight end, I think you have a really good chance of getting something done.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you include that's the key. You have to include a tight end with whatever you're doing. Like you could do ETN and McBride, and you might be able to get a Mark Andrews with that, just because ETN his ADP is only a couple spots after Mark Andrews, and then you're adding as people see a high upside tight end, you could add a Dalton Schultz or Evan Engram, whatever it needs to be. But if you can get somebody close to that tight end value, add somebody that's ranked as a top 12 tight end and move up to that elite tier, it's totally worth getting off of that flex player for the tight end.
Yeah, if you take nothing else away from this show, please take this away. You want Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts on your fantasy team. I am telling you, you're not going to regret it. You can replace wide receivers. You can replace running backs. You really cannot replace what these guys can offer you. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I can't guarantee that Kyle Pitts is going to have a tight end one season, but I certainly believe it. I totally believe that, especially when Kelsey's out of the picture, I think Pitts is going to be right there every year. He's going to be a guy that goes in the second round in redraft leagues. Let me go a little more in depth on Kyle Pitts because we know Mark Andrews, like we've seen what he can do. It's really just about the Ravens offense and whether they can get back to form, which, like I said, I believe they can. But with Kyle Pitts, I've seen a ton of discourse on Twitter. I think it's pretty bad faith discourse. I don't think that they're the types of people that I like to get my information from, but there have been a lot of tweets where people talk about how Kyle Pitts is a bust or Kyle Pitts is terrible. Kyle Pitts has been so bad in fantasy football. Kyle Pitts hasn't proven anything. These are just wildly ignorant statements. Like Chris said, he had 1,000 yards as a rookie. It's the second most receiving yards for a rookie tight end, like in the modern NFL era. So to say he hasn't proven anything is kind of ludicrous. You know, he scored 1 touchdown that season. That's why he didn't break fantasy as a rookie. But let's just start with his prospect profile, right? Like I said, 22.6 years old. He came into the league at age 20. He's 6'6", 245 pounds. He runs a 4.49 40. That gives him a 99th percentile speed score. So right off the bat, he has that athletic pedigree to be a league-breaking tight end, right? George Kittle, Darren Waller, Dallas Goedert, these guys are elite athletes. It's not an accident. In 2021, as a rookie, Kyle Pitts was 6th among all tight ends in target share. He was 9th in targets per route run. He was 2nd in average depth of target and 3rd in the league in deep targets at tight end, which is really valuable because most tight ends don't really rack up yardage. We don't see 1,000 yards tight ends every season outside of Kelsey and Andrews. That's because tight ends have low ADOTs. Okay, Kyle Pitts doesn't. He's used downfield like a receiving threat, like a legit threat. He's not just a release valve for the quarterback. He was also 4th in yards per route run. Okay, fast forward to 2022. Injuries derailed that season. I don't think people understand exactly how elite he actually was because of the injuries and because of the low overall pass attempts in the Falcons offense. But he was 2nd among tight ends in target share. He was 1st in targets per route run. He was 2nd in average depth of target once again. 5th in yards per route run. That's with Marcus Mariota at quarterback, by the way. It's harder to be high in yards per route run when your quarterbacks are inaccurate. He was still 5th. And the craziest thing of all, he was 1st in the league in deep targets at tight end, even though he only played 10 games. So it's just unbelievable. Like, if you plot that into the Minnesota offense that TJ Hawkinson was in,
oh my God,
he would have been like, obviously Justin Jefferson's on the Vikings, but he would have been Justin Jefferson. Like if you gave all those numbers to him and a team averaging 40 pass attempts per game, he would have been insane. And I just think people are incapable in some cases of separating the player from the offensive environment. Like, yes, Kyle Pitts was a bust in fantasy last year, but not because of Kyle Pitts. He was a bust in fantasy last year because of the Falcons. And if you want to fade him because he's on the Falcons and you think you can see the future and you know how their offense is going to run this year, next year, whatever, like that's your prerogative. I don't think it's smart. But to fade Kyle Pitts because he's bad and he hasn't produced in the NFL is like one of the stupidest things that I've ever heard. So please look at the numbers below the surface and make your decisions that way. And don't just look at the box score. Chris, I've been talking for a very long time. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't have a question or anything, but just what are you thinking?
You know, I was just thinking that I don't know what I could add to that because that was so comprehensive about Kyle Pitts. I think just what we should take away from this is that it is undeniable that Kyle Pitts is an elite tight end. And that's really all there is to it. He's already shown he's an elite tight end. Going forward, he needs to be valued as an elite tight end. That's really all there is to it. I mean, you gave all the background, all the information. If you can buy Kyle Pitts in your league, pretty much any value you can trade to get him is going to be worth it. It's almost like, you know, how people say like trading for Mahomes or Allen, you know, whatever it pays to get them on your team is worth it. I think it could be the same for Kyle Pitts. I mean, just as Paul said, all those things, they're great evidence of why he could be Travis Kelce for the next 10 years. Like, what would you pay to get 10 years of Travis Kelce? Think about that. You pay 4 first-round picks more. Yeah. You know, to guarantee it, you pay a lot to get that.
Yeah, and we can't guarantee it, and that's why we're not telling you to trade 4 first-round picks. But the point still remains.
I would not trade 4 first-round picks for Kyle Pitts. I'm just saying, right? If you could guarantee it, you would trade that, if not more.
Yeah, he is the closest thing we have to a guarantee at his age. And other than maybe Brock Bowers, there is nothing coming down the pike. Forget about Dalton Kincaid. He might be good. He's not that good. And forget about Pat Fryermuth. Forget about TJ Hawkinson. That's for sure. Nobody else in the tight end landscape has the potential that Kyle Pitts has. And that's why he is so valuable. We're not saying it's a guarantee. We're not saying he's going to do it. And who am I, honestly, to even make guarantees in the first place? But I absolutely believe that he's going to have a 1,300-yard season. He's going to have, I think he'll have multiple seasons where you see him putting up those types of Kelsey numbers. It might not be this year with Desmond Ridder and a pass-heavy Falcons offense, but we're really bad at projecting offenses year to year. Like, we don't know what it's going to look like. It changes like crazy, right? Everybody thought A.J. Brown was bad in his rookie year with Mariota, and then all of a sudden they flip it over to Ryan Tannehill, and it's like, oh my gosh, he's a revelation. He's amazing. And then he was, a second round startup pick, and everybody lived happily ever after. So we don't know what these offenses are going to look like. Things can change in a hurry. What if Desmond Ridder is really good? Or what if he's really bad? And then they get
Caleb Williams
or Drake May, right?
Right.
It's all so fluid. Things just cycle through. Like sometimes you get DJ Amore. Sometimes you get 5 years in a row where everything sucks. And that, that's a bummer, but you can't bet on that happening. Like you can't just say, well, I'm going to stay away from this incredibly talented player because I have a crystal ball and I know that their offense is going to be bad. Like you don't know that. So have a little humility in terms of situations and just bet on talented players. Don't do the opposite and draft TJ Hawkinson in the 4th round because you don't care about player talent and you want to just bet on situations, because situations are far more fragile than talent and they change crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the Falcons, they could sign Kirk Cousins next year. They could sign even a Derek Carr or Jimmy G type of player God, that would really increase their pass volume and make Kyle Pitts a good asset.
Oh, come on. Jimmy G can't support a fantasy relevant tight end. When has he ever had a fantasy relevant tight end?
I don't know. I think he had Greg Kittle for a few years, maybe.
Yeah, Greg Kittle was pretty good for a few years. That's true. So that's what we're saying. Go get an elite tight end. What if you can't get an elite tight end? Because we've been talking about this for a long time. Let's just look a little bit further now. Let's say the Andrews owner is not budging, the Pitts owner is not budging. They're very sensible people and they know what's coming, so they don't want to trade these tight ends. I've had this happen. It's very sad. How do you approach your tight end position after that? Who are some guys you'd be targeting?
So if I can't get an elite tight end, I'm kind of going to punt the position until I really like Greg Dulcich or Chig Okonkwo. They're just two younger guys that showed a lot of potential in their early careers, and I think they could be in line for where they could move up to that, Goddard tier, that second tier of tight ends. I really don't want to draft anybody in the middle tier. It just seems too expensive to do that, where you're kind of getting like the hope of production, but they're also older. If I'm going to miss out on the elite guys, I want to scrape the bottom of the bucket, the young guys that show potential, and I just want to collect a bunch of them.
So that middle tier would be starting with Hawkinson, Kittle, Goddard. Who else would you consider in that group?
Like Fryermuth, Schultz, Engram. Like, I don't want any of these guys on my team. I want multiple shots later in the draft. I'm just avoiding that whole middle tier, and I'm shooting for Dulcich, Okonkwo, Laporta, Meyer, Musgrave, Likely. Like, I'm just scraping the bottom of the barrel and taking 3 of them, 4 of them, hoping one hits.
As much as I love that approach, and I do like those guys you named, I don't know if that's necessarily realistic for teams that are like have aspirations to contend this season, right? Like, are you saying that even on a, like, if you have a strong roster, it doesn't matter, you're just going to have those guys and just cross your fingers that one of them works out? Or like, are you willing to invest in a George Kittle or a Pat Fryermuth or something to give yourself a little bit more stability, a little bit more weekly ceiling at the position?
Yeah, if I'm a contender, I guess my favorite target right now would probably be Waller, just because he's the cheapest of the group, and he might honestly have the most upside with how devoid that wide receiver room is. But yeah, in general, I'm really not trying to buy those mid-tier tight ends. I just don't think because when someone owns one of those tight ends like Kittle or Goddard, they're almost valuing them close to that elite tier tight ends, because to them they have a top 6 tight end, and that's really valuable to them. Mm-hmm. But it's just such a step down from what they're actually getting from a top 3 tight end that the value drop that they're doing really isn't worth it. So that's kind of why I want to scrape the bottom. But yeah, I mean, Waller, Njoku's another good guy to target if you're a contender. Schultz is a guy I like. I think that, he's not super talented, but he can take advantage of a situation, and he could find himself being CJ Stroud's favorite target in Houston. So I just that's what I do at the position, at least.
Yeah, I think Schultz kind of has the potential to be like arbitrage TJ Hawkinson, right? Like a kind of a discount version of that like PPR machine who just kind of soaks up those short area targets. But I agree with you. It's hard to get those mid-tier guys outside of startups. People do tend to value them really highly. So I like Waller. I like Njoku. I think those are good discount options. Evan Ingram's not that hard to get. But I do love me some Greg Dulcich. I talked about him a lot last week. I posted a little clip on Twitter because of all the talk. I think he needs to be ranked ahead of Chigakonkwo pretty comfortably, just because what we saw Dulcich do last year in his limited sample was just frankly more impressive. Like fifth most receiving yards per game for a rookie tight end since the year 2000. He's very efficient. Now Sean Payton's talking him up. The main knock on him was that people thought Sean Payton didn't like him because of some comments that were kind of taken out of context, honestly. But now he's talking about him like the main receiving threat in that tight end room, and he's got a lot of routes that he wants him to run and stuff. So I think it's wheels up for Dulcich. I think Okonkwo is interesting just because of, like we said, there's so little upside at the position that it's worth taking a swing on him. Although I think the Titans offense is just going to be so bad this year. It's a little bit concerning. Sam Laporta and Michael Mayer are also interesting for this, just for the sense that they're going later. They are unknowns, and in that way, they have upside. They have draft capital. They have good prospect profiles. So they have a lot of potential to accrue value at least, and potentially flash, what we want to see moving forward for potentially elite guys or in that next year sub-elite guys. So I think that's pretty good. After you get past like the Trey McBride, Cole Kmet range, it really falls off a cliff. And at that point, you're really up the creek. Like if you have Mike Gesicki, Jawan Johnson, Dawson Knox as your tight end one, you're in trouble. Like you're just hoping they catch a touchdown that week, and they're not going to catch a touchdown every week. So I would really be trying to get above that tier, but I don't want to overpay in the same right, because it can get pretty flat in the scoring. So you got to tread lightly. I think those are some guys you can target. And I think that does wrap up our tight end discussion for the day. Let's move on to the next topic here, which won't take quite as long. But it's a format that both Chris and I feel pretty strongly about. And I think it's rising in popularity, but not enough people are doing it yet. And it's Dynasty Best Ball. So we're taking the idea of best ball. And to be clear, what I don't mean by that is like no waivers or no trades. Like all the Dynasty Best Ball leagues that I'm in have waivers, they have trades. What I'm referring to is just the feature in Best Ball where your lineup is automatically set with your highest scoring players for the week. So rather than going in and selecting like, I want to start Jerry Jeudy this week and not Keenan Allen, you just go into the week, and as players score points, they populate your lineup, and whoever's the highest just goes in that spot. This is a really cool format, and most of the leagues I've joined this year have been this format. And so Chris and I just want to talk a little bit about why we like this format so much, why we think you should give it a try. And then I want to go over a couple of tactical differences. If you are in one of these leagues or you're thinking of joining, what's different? So Chris, why don't you start us off? Why is it that you enjoy Dynasty Best Ball?
So one of my favorite video games that I've ever played was Overwatch. What do the developers of Overwatch want to make? They want to make a fun game, right? What's not fun? Running out of ammo. Overwatch, all their characters, you can't run out of ammo ever during the match. That's great. It's fun. All the characters are OP. They fight OP with OP. Everything's good. Nothing's good, So in fantasy football, let's have fun. You know what sucks about fantasy football? When your player gets hurt on the first play of a game. When your player gets ruled active, but then mysteriously doesn't play a snap and says, oh, he wasn't healthy enough to play. Like, these are the kind of things that it's just, there's nothing you can do about it. It's not about being good at fantasy. It's not about being bad at fantasy. It's about being unlucky. And just the Dynasty Best Ball, you still do everything to put yourself in the best position you possibly can each week with trades and waivers and, everything you normally do. It just kind of removes that RNG of, it's almost like turning injuries off, where, like people love to compare fantasy to the NFL when they talk about rule changes in their leagues. If your starting quarterback in your NFL team gets hurt, you get to put in your backup quarterback. You're not just left without a quarterback playing 10 versus 11 the rest of the game. In Dynasty Best Ball, if your quarterback gets hurt, it's okay because your second quarterback will just get put in your lineup for you. And I just want to have, fun playing fantasy football. Also, it is another factor where we're in a lot of leagues. I'm in 14 leagues. I think Paul's in more leagues than that. Maybe not by too many, but on Sunday mornings becomes a hassle where you're checking every one of your leagues for the waiver wire, for the inactives, the unactives. And then another thing where you're like there's a game time decision for Monday Night Football. Okay, well, do I play them and hope they play? Do I not play them and then risk them scoring 30 points on my bench? It's just all the annoyances of fantasy football that you personally can't do anything about get pushed to the wayside when you play in best ball. So I just think it's a lot more fun. A lot more times, actually, the better team does end up winning. People think, oh, their bench player goes off and mine doesn't, so therefore I lost. Well, that can still happen in a regular managed league where if your starter, Justin Jefferson, scores 2 and their starter, Jerry Jeudy, catches 4 touchdowns, how's that any different, So I really do like Dynasty Best Ball, and I think a lot more people should try it.
Yeah, that's really well said. I love the Overwatch analogy. I love the point about real football and being able to sub in a backup, right? We don't have any functionality exactly like that where you set a backup for a player, but what we do have is best ball. And then I think that's the next best thing. I think the main issue that this comes down to where people are hesitant to try it is there's a lot of gatekeeping around the fantasy football grind. And if you don't want to do the grind, you don't really like fantasy football. You don't want to monitor the injuries and the inactives right up to kickoff. And you don't want to, figure out who's going to get limited snaps. And you don't want to worry about Monday Night Football last minute decisions. Then you don't really like fantasy and you're not really serious about it. Okay. Well, that's stupid because this is a game and we play it for fun and we're allowed to not like aspects of that game. If you like that, like the fantasy football grind, then so be it. Like stay in your managed leagues, whatever. But you don't need more stress, especially for portfolio players like myself and Chris. When you're in like 10 plus leagues, that's a serious hassle. Like I have enough trouble putting in waiver claims for the week. I don't need all this other stuff. Like for me, it's chores. That's not what I like about fantasy. I like game theory. I like player evaluation. I like making trades that make my team better. I don't like having to worry about checking every lineup and, oh man, I accidentally left in T. Higgins and he's not playing this week. That's stupid. And you don't have to feel the same way as me, but that the way that I feel about it isn't a less valid way to feel about it. So first of all, let's touch on the injury thing, because I think that's really the biggest point. You cannot predict injuries in game, and it's not a skill to start players that don't get hurt. So let's just look back at 2022, right? We have Trey Lance in week 2, scores 2.5 points, breaks his ankle. We have Tua in week 4, scores 3.4 points, concussion. We have T. Higgins and Dalton Schultz, both in week 5 last season. They both scored 0 points. They played under 20% of the snaps.
Yeah, one of my redraft leagues, I actually had T. Higgins and Dalton Schultz, and there were multiple weeks where both of them, there was a week where T. Higgins was ruled active and then didn't play. Both of them
I think it was
had
that
multiple week. 0 games by either getting hurt or being ruled active and not playing. So, yeah, just go back. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and there was no way to absolutely know that. Like you could have played it safe, like, oh, he was dealing with an injury in practice. But, what if your next best option is Mecole Hardman? Like, what are you supposed to do in that situation? So in best ball, great. Higgins isn't playing. Okay, well, maybe if Mecole Hardman gets 4 points this week, at least I get those 4 points. But in a managed league, you don't. We had Rondale Moore lost people matchups in week 11 because he scored negative 0.6 fantasy points and then went out of the game. Like there were teams that literally lost by 0.1 that were ahead with Rondale Moore in their lineup and then lost. Other guys just went out. Rashad Penny, J.K. Dobbins, Kadarius Toney, Mike Williams. All of those guys had at least one game where they left significantly early in the game, scored almost no points. There was no way of knowing that was going to happen. So these are high-profile players. These are guys that you would have had in your lineups that you are punished because they got hurt. You didn't do anything wrong. And I don't think it's a bad thing to want to balance that out a little bit. My favorite example of this is in week 10 last season. One more player I didn't mention, Cooper Kupp, was on an absolute rampage, 22 points per game. In week 10, he scored 2.9 points, suffered a high ankle sprain, left the game. Now, think it's fair to say that if you had put Cooper Kupp on your bench that week, you're a bad fantasy manager. Like you're literally an idiot. Like there's no world where benching Cooper Kupp was like a sharp decision, right? So all of this talk of managing your lineup, making the right decisions doesn't matter. You still got screwed. Meanwhile, in that same week, Nick Westbrook-Akine of the Tennessee Titans, who you may or may not have heard of because he's not a very good player, he scored 28.9 fantasy points. I don't think we could ever say that the guy who played Nick Westbrook-Akine over Cooper Kupp that week is smart, and yet he would have been rewarded. Whereas in the best ball situation, you can start the correct player. When they get hurt, you're still punished because in most situations, the next best player is going to score fewer points. But at least if you roster somebody like in Nick Westbrook-Akine, you can get lucky and you can get that spot filled in with points. And I understand there's still luck involved, but for me, I much prefer the what I call positive randomness of a player scoring more points than I expected, as opposed to the negative randomness of a player who should score a lot of points, not scoring them, especially when it's due to an injury or some random circumstance that's unpredictable.
Yeah, and I mean, just having the guys that you stash on your bench, like, those end of bench people, those are people you believe in personally, are usually a truther for them. They usually don't perform well in fantasy all the time. And seeing those guys, pop off for one game and actually getting to see them enter your lineup is so rewarding instead of stashing these guys, hoping for them to get a guaranteed role. So you're just never playing them. But, with best ball, they get put into your lineup and you get points out of them and you feel good about the decisions you made.
That's a great point, actually, because the other thing I wanted to say, and you covered it, is like nobody was starting Nick Westbrook-Akine. So now you have this like crazy blow up 29-point week that is like completely useless for fantasy. Like I personally think it's more fun that every time something like that happens, it actually impacts a fantasy football game. Like I think that's way cooler. The fact that like all of these players on the end of benches, they actually get to impact fantasy football. Like the game becomes so much bigger. There are so many more things to think about. The way that you manage your bench becomes so much more interesting because you have to weigh the options. Like, are you going to hold more injured players on your bench? They can't contribute to your lineup, right? Are you more inclined to trade away a Wan'Dale Robinson after he tears his ACL because that bench spot could be somebody that actually could contribute to your lineup? There's just a lot of tactics there that don't exist in managed leagues. Whereas in managed leagues, the main gimmick, the main feature is that you have to choose who to start and who to sit. And this is supposedly the ultimate skill of fantasy football. And I reject this premise entirely. I think start sit is probably the least skilled aspect of fantasy football. I don't believe that choosing between, let's say, I don't know, Jerry Jeudy and Devonta Smith last season is something that requires endless amounts of skill. What I think is that in most situations, your choice is either obvious or random. So, for example, obvious choice, Cooper Kupp over Nick Westbrook-Akine. Okay, just by tapping the little buttons on your phone to make that choice, that's not skill. Everybody knows to do that. Yep. When you get into the questionable decisions, you can say that it's skill, but ultimately, when you have players projected similarly, it's more like a coin flip. And when you make the decision and the guy you picked is the better scorer, yeah, of course you chalk that up to your intuition and your insight. And when it doesn't work out, it's bad luck. And you should have been right, but you weren't because of this thing you didn't foresee. That's called confirmation bias. Okay. That is not skill. That is just you attributing certain random outcomes to skill and certain random outcomes to randomness, when in reality, they're all randomness. You could make your start sit decisions with the highest projected player. That's what I suggest. You could just choose the jersey color you like better. You could pick the name that sounds cooler. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, you're going to be like 55-45 either way, specifically when we're talking about those questionable decisions. Everything else is, like I said, obvious. You start your studs, right? That's what they always say. Well, most of the players you're starting are those obvious guys. It's usually one or two decisions every week that you have to make. And those decisions are ultimately random. You can say this guy has a better matchup or this guy has a worse matchup. Half the time that doesn't work out. Like I wrote a start sit column for 3 years and maybe I just suck at start sit, whatever. But honestly, from the other articles that I've read and I've like cross-referenced them with what happened that week, it's always like half wrong every single time. Half of the starts suck and half of the players you said to sit have good weeks. Like unless you're just picking the most obvious, like, hey, start Stephon Diggs this week. But if you're actually picking players that are in the questionable zone, it never is like 75, 80% success, no matter how sharp you are, because there are too many factors in a 1 week sample that can impact how a game goes.
Yeah, there's a reason why companies sell player prop bets, because we're not good at them. Why would companies do that if you could get it right
Yes.
70 or 80% of the time? We're picking between two things that have almost an infinite number of variables that affect them. Like you said, if the two players are close projection, half the time you're going to be wrong, half the time you're going to be right. You can do all the research you want. You can look up the weather. You can look up the matchups. You can whatever you want to do. It's just it in general, it's not actually going to affect your decision or the result of the decision. What's going to happen is going to happen, and most of the time you just got to chalk up the variance.
Yeah, it is variance. Like a 1 week sample of a football game is variance. That's why we see random players have huge games and then never again. Like we can't take Nick Westbrook-Akina's week 10 of 2022 and extrapolate that out and say, hey, I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1 the rest of the season. If you just take his pace from week 10 and you bring it to the end of the season, we know it doesn't work that way because weeks are random. We use full seasons. Sometimes we use multiple seasons to like actually stabilize data and see what's really happening. And we do that because we know that 1 week samples are random. So I don't know why that gets pushed to the side when it's talking about start sits, but ultimately they're just not interesting to me. They're random. I'm tired of making the wrong choices, especially when I actually put in time and research and decide on a guy for like legitimate reasons. I'll go look at expert consensus rankings. I'll go look at the matchup. How is this team against this position? It doesn't matter because when you put Jerry Jeudy on your bench for Devonta Smith, who has been scoring higher all season, and then Jerry Jeudy catches 3 touchdowns against the Chiefs, it makes you angry. And I just don't want to be angry. Like I would rather my opponent win because his bench player scored 30 points than lose because I started the right player and they scored fewer points. Like that makes me so tilted. So you don't have to feel the same way. That's how I feel. If you've ever felt that way, go get yourself a Dynasty Best Ball League. Just go find one and join it. If you don't like it, whatever. It's just one league. You can keep your other managed leagues, but I think a lot of you will like it because
It
all of
just
these
makes the
reasons.
game more fun. That's what
Yeah.
we're here to do. We're here to have fun. It
Yeah.
makes the game a lot more fun, takes the stress off. It's fun.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. Now I want to touch on a couple of things that are unique about the format. I already went over a couple. Another thing that I like about best ball is, like I said, it makes the game a lot bigger. I think there are more players that are interesting to talk about. So, for example, I find Gabe Davis to be wildly uninteresting. Dynasty Twitter talked about him all offseason. Last year, he was kind of bad this year. He had a couple of big games. In Dynasty Best Ball, I think he's an interesting player because in that offense, he's going to have a few good games, and you don't have to leave him on your bench all year because of the constant duds that you're going to get in a managed league. On the other hand, you can go out and you can get someone like Gabe Davis for a palatable price, and you can feel confident that he'll enter your lineup 3 or 4 times and actually contribute to some of your fantasy matchups. Those are the kinds of players and decisions that I think open up that don't really exist in managed leagues. Like people like to talk about it, but in reality, once you get outside those top 40 players, like it's all kind of random and you can say you like this guy or that guy, but on any given week, they're very likely to let you down. Whereas in best ball, you can actually have takes on players like liking Gabe Davis for his spike weeks, right? Or someone like, I don't know, Alan Lazard becomes more interesting in an Aaron
Or
Rodgers
Josh Palmer,
offense.
just anything.
Yeah,
These guys
Josh
on these
Palmer,
high
right?
volume. Yep.
Somebody like
Yeah.
Nico Collins probably going to have some big weeks this year. I wouldn't touch him in a 10-foot pole in a start sit league. Why would I ever want to start Nico Collins unless it's like a start 14, right? Like if it's 10 lineup spots, I'm never going to play Michael Gallup or Nico Collins or Tyler Boyd or even George Pickens, right? I don't want to start these guys on purpose. But in a best ball format, yeah, I'll stack these guys up. Give me all the Ravens wide receivers. One of them's going to catch a touchdown this week. Like they're interesting. And I just don't think they're interesting in managed leagues. Like all I do in my start sit leagues is I take all of my depth and I trade it for studs so that I can start good players and not even think about start sits. Because like I said, it just screws you. Like having 2 options is I'd rather have one option. I would rather just have one option so I don't have to think about it and I don't have to pull my hair out on Sunday wondering if I picked the right guy all afternoon.
Yeah, I think that covers it right there.
Oh, I've got more. I can keep going. I also think the idea of backup running backs with standalone value, I'm doing air quotes, by the way, if you're listening to audio, standalone value is an absolute farce in managed leagues. Like AJ Dillon has standalone value. Let's draft him in the 6th round. No, he doesn't have standalone value, and he never did. But in a best ball league, he might score 2 touchdowns in a week. He might catch 5 passes in a week. Maybe they go up by 20 points and Aaron Jones sits in the second half and there's an AJ Dillon week, right? The standalone value running backs become much more interesting in best ball. Guys like Roshan Johnson are going to be completely useless in managed fantasy leagues this year. But he's probably going to have some games where he catches a few passes, some games where maybe he stays in for a goal line series. Now he can contribute to your lineup, right? So I just think all of these little angles that you get to think about are so much more interesting than the start sit discussion. I would much rather philosophize about which of these players is worth putting on my bench and how I want to move them around, who I want to trade, than any of this other stuff we were talking about. So that's how I feel. And I think you should definitely give it a try. To bring this back to the tight end position one more time, I also think tight ends are more interesting in Dynasty Best Ball.
Yep.
Shocking, I know. But we talked about this elite tight end thing, right? You need an elite tight end because otherwise you're bleeding points. You're such a disadvantage, right? And these TJ Hawkinson, Dallas Goedert, George Kittle guys get pushed up. But what they get pushed up for is really more consistency than anything. They're more pushed up because they're guys you can be more confident are going to get targets week in and week out. Not that they're going to score massively more points than the field. And so in best ball, if you can just have like an Evan Ingram, Dawson Knox, Juwan Johnson all on your team, the 3 of those guys together can kind of match what you get out of like a Dallas Goedert or out of a Pat Freiermuth, because when you put all of their spike weeks together, it looks like one of those more consistent tight ends. So I think it gives you more options in how you want to handle the position. Whereas in managed leagues, it's like you're just kind of screwed after a certain number of guys. So that's just another angle to it, where these deeper players like Mike Gesicki, Hunter Henry, Dawson Knox,
Taysom Hill.
Taysom Hill. He's such a great best ball tight end. He's unusable in managed fantasy leagues. Like, get him off my team. In best ball, that's a ton of fun because some week he's going to have some 60-yard touchdown run. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, just like you said, in managed leagues, it's elite tight end or you're screwed. In best ball leagues, you actually get to play the position. You get to vary, okay, do I get 2 mid-round guys? Do I get 4 late-round guys? Like, there's actual strategy involved in how you attack the position. And the backup running backs, it's actual value, strategy, and which backup running backs you want to prioritize. It's just the best ball just adds so much to the game. I think you definitely need to try it.
Yeah, and the last thing about it is, like, because it's such uncharted territory, there are all these different angles, like way more than I thought of, that haven't really been talked about yet. So if you're just interested in a format where maybe it's not as cut and dry, there's not as much consensus, I think you have a lot more freedom to try out different strategies in a Dynasty Best Ball, where there's not as much conventional wisdom telling you to do this or that. And there maybe are more edges that can be found in that type of format that we haven't even scratched the surface on yet. So I think it would be cool to get in on the ground floor of a format that's gaining popularity, see what you can, learn about it, and maybe you can have an advantage that you wouldn't have in a regular league. Though, if you stuck through the whole Dynasty Best Ball rant, I appreciate it. And I won't say the words best ball again because I've said them a lot of times and it's
until
probably
next episode.
Annoying. Until next episode, I'm sure I'll bring it up again. At least the next time Chris is here, we'll talk about it again. We are absolute fanboys. So that'll be that for us today. I think we really knocked out the tight end position and gave you a lot to think about there. I hope you'll go send out some offers for Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts. To end the show today, I just want to say thank you so much if you've been watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify. We're now on Apple Podcasts. You can go check out the factory tour there. It really means a lot. This has been a ton of fun so far. We're 8 episodes in. I'm hoping there are a lot more to go. So, the biggest thing you could do for me, honestly, is leave a comment on YouTube. Like, tell me what you think about the show. What have you been enjoying? What are your favorite topics to talk about? What are some things you want me to talk about with my next guest? What are even some things that you don't like? What are your critiques? I would love to hear all that stuff to just try to keep making the show better, make it more enjoyable, and just interact a little bit with those of you that are listening, because it does really mean a lot. So, Chris, do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Yeah, my final thoughts are just elite tight end or go broke and try Dynasty Best Ball League.
Great. You said best ball again. And so did I. All right. Go get a DFF membership, dynastyfootballfactory.com, $20 annual membership. Get all the articles, get all the rankings, get on the Discord, talk to me and Chris, and all the other great analysts over there. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_DFF. Follow Chris on Twitter at ChrisMiles1017. And look out for all of our content over on the site as well. I will see you guys next week on the Factory Tour.